The story of the wise men is another one of those classic stories that we typically associate with Christmas. It's important to understand, however, that the story of the wise men is not included in the Gospel of Luke at all, which means the classic Christmas story you're familiar with, where Mary and Joseph go to Bethlehem and then the shepherds are told and they come to the stable, that's the classic story, but it's not in the Gospel of Luke, followed by the story of the wise men. If you want to find the story of the wise men, you have to go to the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. And you need to note there that Matthew places the story of the wise men after the birth of Jesus. We're not told exactly when it happened. It might have been soon after the birth. But in all likelihood, the visit of the wise men did not happen the night that Jesus was born. So while kind of our culture and tradition sort of places the wise men there at the stable, that's probably not the way it happened. But nonetheless, you can teach that however you want. I just would make you aware that in all likelihood, the wise men came later. It's very possible that they actually showed up when Jesus was around the age of 2. But let's assume that you're going to teach this story in the context of the Christmas event, the larger Christmas event, and that's okay. If so, then there are really two important points that this story needs to make and can make as you look at it. Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. The first point is that Jesus is in fact the King of the Jews as prophesied in the Old Testament. Now we've seen this before when we looked at the story of the prophets, places like Isaiah and Micah, who said that a king would be born, a child would be born. He would be the king, and that's what Jesus was. He was the promised Messiah of the Old Testament. We saw that in the case of Mary's story in Luke chapter 1. We saw it in Joseph's story in Matthew chapter 1. So all of these stories emphasize that Jesus would be the long-awaited Messiah, the long-awaited king prophesied by the Old Testament. Very important. But something else that's important in this story, that is a point you want to make, is that Jesus was recognized as the king, the long-awaited king of the Jews. He was recognized by these foreign Gentile kings, these magi or wise men traveling from the east. They recognized Jesus as the king, where the Jews themselves did not, at this point in time, recognize Jesus as the king. So you've got this interesting thing going on where Matthew's making the point in this story that Jesus is the king, but his own people did not recognize that he was the king, that he was born king of the Jews. Whereas these pagan kings from afar, these pagan Gentiles, did in fact recognize that Jesus was the king of the Jews. So that's the point you want to make in this important story of the wise men visiting Jesus.